All right, well, thanks very much for the introduction, and I thank the organizers also for inviting me today to speak to you today. And thanks to all of you, obviously, for sticking out to the bitter end. So my work may seem a little bit unusual compared to other talks you heard earlier tonight, but I'm hoping that over the next 15 or 20 minutes you gain some appreciation for at least why I think my work is important. So before I start, though, I just want to mention one caveat, and that's that typically when I tell people that I work on sleep, I get one of two types of questions, right? People either want me to diagnose their sleep problems, or they want to tell me about their crazy dreams and have me interpret them. But I'm not going to do any of that tonight, so don't ask me those kinds of questions. I'm not a physician. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm an expert on fly sleep, right? So if you're a fly, I can probably help you, but I don't see too many of those in the audience. So otherwise, if you have that kind of question, I recommend that you consult with a real healthcare provider. So despite what I just said, actually one reason that I work on flies is because they show all the hallmarks of sleep in mammals, including in humans. So an example of this is that flies, just like humans, show long periods of immobility when they're asleep, and during this period of immobility, they're resistant to various types of environmental stimuli that would otherwise evoke a behavioral response from the animal if it were awake. And the same thing is true for you, right? If you're asleep and somebody calls out your name or taps you lightly on the arm, right, you're a lot less likely to respond than if you're awake. Flies also respond to sleep-regulating drugs that humans react to as well. So, this includes caffeine, which promotes waking. Fruit flies also exhibit a really interesting phenomenon that's also seen in humans, and for the purpose of this talk, I'll just refer to it as compensatory sleep regulation. And what this means is that if you deprive an animal of sleep, it has to make up for that lost sleep at a later time. And so that's true, for you. You should probably know intuitively as well. If you pull an all-nighter, then the next night you're going to be more tired, and you're going to have to sleep either more or more deeply to make up for the loss. Flies, like humans, also show large-scale changes in electrical activity across the brain during the sleep state compared to the wake state. Right? So that's also consistent with human sleep. We believe that these parallels make flies a good model organism for studying sleep, and we believe that the lessons we learn from our studies in flies will ultimately inform us about human biology and the underlying mechanisms responsible for control of sleep in humans. But there are other reasons why I like working with flies. They have very rapid reproduction rates. They're easy to manipulate genetically, and they're very cheap to maintain as well. So what that means is that your hard-earned taxpayer dollars, right, are going to go a lot farther towards supporting fly research than research on other types of model organisms. And this, just as sort of an aside, this last point seems to have escaped certain unnamed, but shall we say, famous national politicians who some of you might be able to think of. So for other topics that you might have heard about tonight, it might be more obvious why somebody might want to study them, right? But why would anybody want to study sleep, right? Is sleep really that important? And don't we basically already know that sleep simply involves just shutting down the brain temporarily to allow the brain to recharge? And these are really separate questions. And so I'm just going to address them sequentially. So the first question is really, is sleep all that important? And to that, I would just reply that 20% of all American adults suffer from insomnia on a regular basis. And this is just one of a variety of different types of sleep disorders that afflict the public. Furthermore, well, okay, and so you might say to that, well, big deal. So there are a lot of tired people out there, right? But just suck it up and deal with it, right? That's what we often do. But what you probably don't know is that if you're deprived of sleep for an entire day, for an entire 24 hours, you actually exhibit cognitive impairment that's equivalent to being legally drunk, right? So this is actually a serious problem. And considering that 30% of the population is chronically sleep deprived, and most of these people drive, right? This is probably a contributing factor to a really staggering statistic, which is that about 100,000 automobile accidents every year in the United States are caused by sleepy driving. So this is 100,000 preventable accidents, including many fatalities. And really part of the problem here is that, that when people are chronically sleep deprived, they just get used to that feeling, and they just don't realize that how cognitively impaired they are. But I can assure you, it's a significant problem. So the effects of sleep deprivation, though, aren't confined just to automobile accidents. Sleep deprivation impairs work performance in ways that range from, the prosaic, such as mild performance deficits, to really severe effects. And some examples of the latter are the Chernobyl nuclear accident, the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska, and even the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. In all of these cases, sleep deprivation is thought to have been a contributing factor to human errors that ended up being quite deadly. And furthermore, if you factor in the economic costs of sleep deprivation, it amounts to about $100 billion in lost productivity, medical expenses, and environmental and property damage. Okay, so that kind of covers why sleep is important. But what about our understanding of why it happens at all, right? So from a scientific perspective, I think this is where it gets really interesting. During sleep, part or all of the brain basically shuts out the outside world and becomes impervious to various environmental stimuli. This is what we mean by going unconscious. And all animals that have been studied rigorously for sleep exhibit this. But why would evolution even tolerate this, right? If you think about it, right, when you go unconscious, and if you're an animal, right, this obviously prevents you from carrying out important tasks related to your performance, right, your survival. So as an example of this, right, you can't search for mates, you can't forage for food, and probably most importantly, you can't protect yourself. So, so obviously, whatever benefits sleep endows animals and humans, it has to be more important than these deleterious effects that sleep causes. Right. So, but despite decades of studying sleep, many decades of studying sleep, the biological needs that sleep fulfills is still unknown. So I find this actually, pretty exciting. I like a good mystery, and I also think it's pretty remarkable that we know the functions, the major functions of all the organs in the body, but remarkably, we know so little about this basic function that's sleep that, arguably we spend about 30% of our lives involved in. Although we don't know exactly what cellular needs or molecular needs that sleep is fulfilling, we know they have to exist because, as I said before, the brain compensates for changes at sleep in one time by opposing changes in sleep at another time. So, for example, as I said before, if you pull an all-nighter, right, you're going to be sleepier the next night, and you're going to have to make up for that loss. So from this and other information, we know that a set point has to exist for sleep on a daily basis, and any deviation from this set point has to be compensated at a later time. So these two features, the existence of a set point for sleep and the ability to compensate for changes in sleep, have been used to argue that sleep has to fulfill some type of important physiological need, such that sleep is not simply just a passive outcome of not moving. So, okay, fine, you might say. Maybe you don't care about those details. Maybe you think it's obvious that sleep has to fulfill important needs, because if you go without it, you obviously, suffer certain types of consequences. Among other things, right, you get really tired. So you might think, well, sleep, must obviously be somehow involved in cellular energetics. But it turns out, actually, that I should say, intuitively, that's a very appealing hypothesis. But there's actually very little scientific data to support that. And believe me, scientists have looked for a long time for metabolic energy sources that might be depleted selectively during waking and replenished during sleep. And there's really sort of no consensus that's formed around any one substance that might actually serve this role. And and there also isn't any solid data that that brain-wide cell functions change during sleep as well. Admittedly, it's true that the brain changes its electrical activity during sleep compared to wake, and it also consumes a lot less oxygen than during waking. But it's unclear what the relevance of these changes are. Furthermore, you can give animals drugs that will mimic these effects, and they don't substitute adequately for sleep. Furthermore, you can destroy the circadian clock in animals, and these animals still need to sleep. So that, so a lot of people think the circadian clock drives sleep, but actually, from that data, we know that data in other studies, we know that the circadian clock is really just a timekeeper for the organism that tells the animal or the human what time it is, what time to sleep, but there's some other mysterious process or mechanism that we haven't identified yet that keeps track of the need to sleep at any given time. So from data like these and others, we know a little bit about what's not responsible for sensing sleep need, but we don't know what processes are responsible for this, what's actually being sensed, or even where it's being sensed. And so one way to study the biological basis of sleep need is actually to deprive animals of sleep and then determine how the animal's affected, right? And in terms of the brain, one of the main effects is that the brain can't store information as well as it could if it were if the organism had slept, right? In addition, the brain is impaired in its ability to communicate between functionally distinct regions of the brain. But how this happens is unclear at the moment. And another approach to studying the biological basis of sleep need is a pretty simple one. It's one basically where you generate a whole bunch of genetic mutants, and then you screen these various mutants for effects on sleep need. And then you after you identify some that have the sleep phenotype, you can identify, or you spend some time mapping the gene that's affected. And then you can determine the functions of these genes, which will hopefully tell you something about the function of sleep. So in theory, right, this approach should identify molecules that communicate sleep need. But in practice, it's been a problem to achieve this, particularly in mammalian models of sleep. And I kind of alluded a little bit to why this might be earlier in my talk. And so mammals typically take much longer to reproduce. They're much more expensive to maintain, and it's much more time-consuming and complicated to map genetic mutations in mammals. So these kinds of problems have opened the door to related studies in model invertebrate organisms like flies. And so as I said earlier, right, flies are cheap to maintain. You can grow them up very quickly, and they're genetically very, they're easy to manipulate genetically. So just as an example of some of these features, right, my lab can routinely grow up a lot of flies in about 2 weeks, and then we actually can screen these animals for changes in sleep over a period of a week on a scale of about 2,000 animals simultaneously and independently as well. So you'd think with this kind of efficiency we would have solved this problem by now, right? But obviously we haven't. But we have begun to make headway with this approach I just told you about. But somewhat, but we rapidly ran into a problem that a lot of brain researchers encounter, which is that to understand how a gene functions, you really need to know how it's working in the relevant cells, right? And it's been really, really challenging to actually identify the cells that are relevant for candidate sleep-regulating molecules. And so we've taken a step back from this kind of molecules-first approach and asked a slightly different question, which is, what are the neuronal circuits or the population of neurons in a fly's brain that are involved in sensing sleep need? And the way that we've been trying to do this is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to explain it briefly. And the basic way that we try to achieve this is we place a foreign gene in the fly, right? So this is a gene that's not normally found in the fly. And this gene encodes a protein that produces a small amount of electric current, but only when the ambient temperature that the flies are in is elevated just slightly. Okay? So what this allows us to do basically is to produce this protein in different groups of neurons in the fly brain, and then elevate the temperature to activate those neurons, and then test whether whether that activation of that particular group of neurons has any effect on sleep need, right? And so what we found is in the vast majority of cases, we get no effect on sleep need when we activate different groups of neurons in the fly's brain. But in a very small percentage, what we find is that we can actually, so when we stimulate the particular population of neurons, we can actually wake the flies up. That's supposed to be what's shown here in this graph. Basically, this is sleep at night here, and the blue group here is the one that gets the stimulation. You can see in this particular group, right, the animals are woken up by this stimulation at a time that they would otherwise be asleep. And then when the stimulation ends, it releases them from this behavior, and as a result, they undergo this compensatory sleep increase that I told you about before. That is one of the hallmarks of sleep need, right? So, so here is a picture of a fly brain and some of the cells that we've actually identified in our experiments. And to my knowledge, the best of my knowledge, this is the first time anybody's actually demonstrated or identified neurons that are involved in driving sleep. And at this point, all I can say is that it appears that these neurons are found in the brain and actually connect the brain to locomotor control centers in the thorax of the animal. So that's kind of like our chest, right? And we think that these neurons are involved in integrating higher order signaling events in the brain, and then somehow or other this leads to a decision to sleep, in which case these neurons communicate to these motor control centers to stop the animal from moving, right? And that's what happens when you sleep as well, right? Obviously, you shouldn't be moving around anyway. And so how that decision is actually made, though, is going to have to await the identification of the actual molecules that are found in these neurons that are involved in communicating this sleep need. So with that knowledge, we hopefully will be able to say sometime soon what sleep is actually doing to the nervous system that's so important. So I think I have just maybe a couple minutes left. So in the remaining time, I just want to end on a couple of points. So first, what information do we actually hope to obtain from our studies? And what really, I hope is apparent by now, what really drives me is figuring out the cellular needs that sleep fulfills. And I really hope that eventually we're going to be able to address that. And on a more philosophical level as well, I think that we're going to be able to learn something more about what it means to be conscious by studying sleep. And this may even bear on how we ultimately value other life forms as well. And finally, on a practical level, I think that since about 60% of all American adults suffer one or more sleep problems on a weekly basis, and there aren't good treatments for a lot of these underlying problems, we're hopeful that through these studies we'll be able to identify molecules that are involved in communicating sleep need that might be novel pharmacological targets for intervening in various different types of sleep disorders, and ultimately contributing to an increase in overall safety and human health and well-being. So with that, I actually have two more slides. In this slide, I just want to reiterate my gratitude to the organizers for putting on this event, and also to our sponsors who provided the venue and presumably coughed up some money, I think, to sponsor the event as well. And then lastly, I just have one other slide. So if you were bored throughout my talk and got nothing out of it, then I have this slide for you. So probably some of you have seen this before. If you've never seen this before, right, then you will learn one point from this, which is Taco Cat spelled backwards is still Taco Cat. And if you don't find that profound, then I suggest that you hurry up and get a couple more drinks, and then maybe you'll appreciate it a little bit better. So I'll just end on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.